All right, thank you so much. I just want to start off by sharing a space of gratitude for opportunity to have space to work. As folks know, it's not easy being a working artist. And finding space to create is very difficult. Finding space to live is difficult. And so just grateful always to the EFA, grateful to the Potato Farm Project for providing me space. So this has been wonderful. I'm going to share my screen so that we can get started. So, great. So I want to start off by first speaking about what got me to this present moment, being here on this call with everyone, and how it ties into a larger scope of my life practice. It's more than just a body of work. It really is about life practice. And so the first image that we're seeing is a collage of images that are mine, but also our family archives. I came to photography through my father, actually. My father was an avid photographer in his teens. And when he immigrated to the United States in the late 70s, his older brother gifted him a camera. And that was one of the ways in which my father was able to acclimate himself into a new space. And I grew up being absolutely obsessed with my family archives. I would spend hours organizing them chronologically, or what I thought was chronologically. I wasn't alive for half of those pictures, but in my head, I was organizing them through a linear story. And when I turned 15, my father gifted me the camera that was gifted to him. And I started my deep love of taking images. I also would study photography at the same high school that my father did. And so generations apart, we found ourselves in the same exact darkroom in a school that used to be a castle in Queens. And so there's so much of that story that is part of all of the reasons why I create, and the legacy of my family and what I want to leave behind for the next generation. I do not have children, but I am blessed to have a huge family, and my family members, my cousins who are siblings, and also my siblings have children, and I want them to grow up with the same love of our family lineage, which with every generation, we are creating even more distance between ourselves and our history and our homeland, and rewriting what our history is based on soil, on land, the fact that we find ourselves in the States and not back home in the Caribbean. So I wanted to start off with this image of home, the lower image of the cars in what we call una carretera, which is a very old highway that existed in the islands, which now has been replaced with a rather new one, was taken by my father. And honestly, even though they've built a new highway, nothing has changed in terms of the view. It still looks very much like that when you're traveling across the country in the Caribbean. And you're seeing a poem that I wrote that's part of my daily practice. I write every morning. Some of that writing is my dreams, messages that I get from family members, and poems that are about my life and about what I'm experiencing and witnessing in any given moment. And the other image that you see of the palms braided, this is something that you see on the coast in the Caribbean. Folks will braid the palms to create shelters from the sun. And so it's creating these sort of nomadic homes, just knowing how to tend to soil, tend to land. You can always create a space of comfort. And so my work travels the sea. I travel between the island of what we call modern day La República Dominicana, the Dominican Republic, indigenous name Quisqueya, Haiti, and our current Turtle Island in the United States. And my work is about navigating that space, that temporal space, that we then have to recreate sort of the rules of navigation when we are thinking about physical space, and also emotional space as we are trying to exist and survive. And so these are images that are part of this life body of work, which is about home as physical space, home as body, as family, home as memory, and home as the most important part, which is what I carry with me, which is my soul, or the interconnectedness of every single one of us who have our own history and our own lineage to carry. And this is not something that will end. It just is in constant transformation. And it's through this transformation that I think a lot about the way that we can transmute energy. And from being from the Caribbean and being an Afro-Indigenous woman and all that comes with that, there's a lot of healing that has to be done within the concept of home, because we have been removed from home and it wasn't a choice. And so when that choice isn't yours, but then you do have the choice in your adulthood to return, what do you do with all of those emotions that come up with you, of all of the things that you lost, that you never experienced? And with that is beauty, is joy, tragedy, sadness, and that all of those things coexist in our lives. And this is an image of my aunt, who is one of the beautiful women in my family that co-parented me. I lost my mother in my 20s, and this aunt, my tia Patria, was someone who I lived with, and became a mother. In my family, we we fortunately and unfortunately have many parents, and so she was one of my parents. And when I visit her now in the Caribbean, there's so much of who we are tied to labor, that's women's work, and tied to the kitchen, and tied to the cultivation of life, really, even when it is food. So this is a diptych that I took of her with guandules, which anyone who had to shuck guandules knows that it's not something that you want to be around for. But taking pride in these acts of labor now as an adult, and documenting them, because I realize that the next generation won't have the same connection to home as I do, and to these acts that haven't changed through time. I mean, shucking guandules is still done the same way as it was hundreds of years ago. And so sort of owning that labor of working with living, breathing things. And part of my practice is process. I'm a very process-driven person. And so I tend to create a lot of the materials that I work with. So I'm not just making a photograph in the moment, but I'm also thinking about how am I making the actual image throughout the entire process, and making that visible to others. And so I am a printmaker. I focus mostly on antiquarian photographic processes. And what that means is that the processes that I work with are very old. They're from the early 1800s. And involve a lot of chemistry. A lot of that chemistry is heavy metals, and they're horrible for the environment and also horrible for our health. And so I started to move away from this chemistry, and this image and this diptych that we're seeing here. I'm really showing it because I want to show the process of creating this photograph, which involves platinum and palladium metals. And so that the black that you're seeing on the edges, and some of it looks like brush strokes, is exactly that. In order to get the image, I actually have to create the emotion using chemistry and brush it onto my paper. And then I expose using the sun. My negative is the size of my image. So there are many things that have to be thought out before I actually get a photograph, which the entire process from shooting to drying the image will take anywhere from like 2 weeks to a month, maybe even longer, depending on the process. And so now I've complicated my life even more and added more labor to it, because I wanted to step away from the extractive process of working with these antiquarian metals, metal-based processes, and start with organic processes. And so I began thinking about, well, how in the world am I going to make a photograph using plants? Like, how do those things even relate? How am I going to do it? And really what it is to think about it as the fact that photography prior to colonization, and I want to say photography as in the study of light, because that's what it is. It's a study of light and study of spectrum, involved salt and involved creating pigments out of plants and creating what's called a gum bichromate print, which is a photographic print that you create building up layers, but you need watercolor. So I was like, all right, I know gum bichromate. I'm going to start off by creating my entire bank of pigments to create watercolors. So I began creating pans of watercolor. So what we're seeing here is a box that I created of pigments using shells and some leaves in order to create this color gamut to then create photographs. So I started off this way, and it's still going, and I'm still refining the process and refining the practice. And where does that take me to? Is that I started that process of creating these watercolor pigments at the same time that I was really thinking about printing on fabric, specifically on silk chiffon, very thin fabric that's similar to like a kozu paper, or mulberry paper, more Far Eastern Asian style papers that are very translucent, or can be very translucent and delicate, and trying to figure out how will I get a photograph on fabric. And so I made this installation last year, and I'm going to play this small video of walking around it, and you can hear my voice. That's very loud. Because what ends up happening is when you're printing on this kind of fabric is that you get a holographic effect. So when you're in the space, it's almost as if you're traveling through time. And I wanted to create this illusion of traveling through a memory and combine this experiment of printing on very fine silk fabric with my experiments with creating pigments and gum bichromate, and really figure out how do I combine them and how do I make it work for me. Immediately after I created this, I went back home to the Caribbean and started to work with plants that were around me. And there were individuals that were very, very, very helpful, farmers that would save things for me, save me seeds that they noticed would give off color and that they thought I might be able to work with. I would go foraging. I try to forage as much as I can, and always doing it in an equitable manner. So I'm combing the floor before anything else. And when I am harvesting from a live plant, making sure that I'm taking only what I need and leaving as much as possible. And so I began creating these large tapestries, really just trying to figure out if the color that I'm seeing in this seed or this vegetable or this flower, this leaf, soil is indeed the color I'm going to get, because what ends up happening is because of the natural chemical compounds that exist in the plants and the pH level of the water that you're working with, and also how plants respond to heat, is that colors shift. And so a plant that's purple may actually not give you purple at all, but may give you yellow. So, it's kind of a trickery of the eye. And so those are all the kind of things that I wanted to figure out and record so that I can try to control the process or understand the process a little bit further. And I started to think about working with different kinds of soils that within themselves are naturally high in certain metals. And so they could also emulate some of the photographic processes that I was working with. And so we're seeing just a little bit of offering from what I was working on right before I came to this residency. And so all of this stuff has brought me to where I am in the space. And this is another image of using a native fruit to our beautiful island, the hagua, which it's very sacred to us, and we use it in ceremony. We use it to paint our bodies. We use it as insect repellent. We drink it because it makes the most delicious fermented drink. You can make sweets out of it, and you can dye with it. So I was also dyeing with these things. And one of the beautiful things that ended up happening right before coming back to the States is that I began collaborating with indigenous folks back home who had this really beautiful bank of knowledge around plants, and creating for them clothing, ceremonial regalia, actually, that they would use during their ceremony. And so these are some garments that I made before coming to Long Island, using only indigenous plants and soil from home, specifically from the northern coast. And so this is a small clip of some of the things that I was able to create. All right. And so here I'm in a completely different environment, still by the sea, which is very important, and immersed in nature, but it's spring in the Northeast. And so things are blossoming, things are coming into life, things are overflowing and overgrowing. And with that is our beautiful mugwort, another incredible plant of ours here in the Northeast that we see as an invasive, but is so important to indigenous communities on Turtle Island. And it's used in teas, it's used in ceremony for opening up your intuition, for allowing dreams to communicate with you. And it's also used for inflammation in the body. It's used for so many different things. And we just rip it up and kind of tear it up. And we don't want it in our property because it overtakes. But you can use it for so many different things. And so I started to use it here in Long Island to think about, well, what color would mugwort give me? What is its color? I know it looks green, but will it actually give me green? Will I be able to do printing with it, not just dyeing with it, but will I be able to print with it? So I would harvest. I'd go on walks. I go on at least 2 walks a day to harvest. And usually that's in the evening. Sometimes it's in the morning or in the afternoon, depending on what it is that I'm looking for. But this is me harvesting a whole bunch of mugwort and breaking it down so that I can soak it. Also lilac. Lilac is right now, or well, up until a week ago, was in full bloom, giving off all of its beauty and glory. And also thinking about what colors that might offer me. Will it offer me anything? I know that it's this beautiful purple lavender, but does not mean that that's what it's going to give me. And working with other plants that are blossoming right now, we have a lot of tulips that are coming into life, and cedar and lots of pine. So I would go out and I would harvest and I would process these. So it takes me quite some time before I get any kind of result, because I have to go through a process first with the fabric and then go through an entire process with the plant. And here you see kind of a short view of my table, my work table in the studio. And these are some of the beautiful tulips that I harvested maybe 2 weeks ago, kind of hanging out. And you see on the right-hand side a piece of fabric that has different petals and different pieces of plant life on it and leaves that are about to get rolled up in order to get steamed. And part of all of this is your substrate, right? So I was thinking about really fancy silks, really fancy chiffons, but I also want to think about what are other fabrics, what can other fabrics do for me? How will they respond to taking certain pigments? And essentially, how will they respond to taking a photograph? And so what you're seeing here are these test strips that are drying after being processed in various mordant baths. So you have to process your fabric in order to receive any color. So it wants to hold color. And I wanted to experiment with different mordants that are not metal based. This is very important because when you go online and you look at how to dye fabric, how to, create eco prints, mordants are really important part of the step, but a lot of them rely on heavy metal. And I want to move away from that, especially in the Caribbean, where I won't have access to a hardware store where I can go buy copper and all of these kinds of things. And it's also very expensive. I wanted to think about what plants are just naturally high in certain minerals and metals. What plants are used because of their tannin properties? So doing a lot of research actually in Asian culture, who have had beautiful documentation of their processes through time, just doing research in a way like, well, what plants were being used, what roots were being used that were high in tannins that I could use as a mordant. So I was thinking a lot about that. And because we are in the Northeast, oak galls are super high in tannin and create the most and because of that create the most beautiful black dye. So you actually have to be really careful with it because you can over dye something. So thinking about those kinds of things that I could replicate back home. And after my fabric is processed, it has to go through an entire process of taking and receiving the color, which means that it needs heat. On one of my walks, I source all of my sturdy sticks. Traditionally, that is also done with metal, with copper, iron rods, because they all leach color, or aluminum, or even certain woods that would also leach out their tannins. But I wanted to, recycle and be as eco-conscious as possible. So I would just pick up sticks basically, clean them off, try to choose the ones that were as straight as possible, that weren't growing any molds, that were already bleached by the sun, if I could find that. And that's what I would use to wrap my fabrics in. So I would have to wrap my fabrics with my processed plants. So my plants need to soak in water for a little while, usually overnight before I start working with them. And they need heat. I'm working with really big pots. And the beautiful thing of the studio is that I'm right outside a fire pit. And when the weather was nice, and it is nice today, but it's also been raining quite a bit, I was able to make a fire in order to steam my bundles and also dye my large pieces of fabric. And this takes hours, which is the other thing. And you have to leave them overnight. And so the next day I will come and I will unravel them and I'll see, well, what happened? What gave me what color? What is working for me? What is not? And this is just a small snippet of some of my tests of trying to figure out, well, what does mugwort do? Well, look how beautiful mugwort comes out. It actually shows up very clearly. And some of the tulips and other pieces of maple that I was harvesting while I was walking around also come up and give really beautiful colors. So here you're seeing my detailed notes of every step so that I know exactly how to replicate this. And I created these swatches. I have many of them now of all of the plants that I've worked with while being here, of the different kinds of fabric and also the mordants that I was using, the plants that I was using in order to mordant the fabric. And so I have this really great swatch book that's unique to this area. If I picked up and moved even a town over, I wouldn't get the same color because the variables change. And this is a view of my studio wall, which is right over to my left-hand side that you can't see at the moment, but of the different colors I was able to get. I was able to get these beautiful greens from the mugwort. I was able to get these beautiful pinkish, like a pinkish blush from pine. And eucalyptus gave me this gorgeous yellow. Maple, some of the maple gave me this really dark blue that almost looks like indigo, which I wasn't expecting. So all of these really beautiful surprises. And now you're seeing really large pieces because I have these small swatches, but then I also have much larger pieces using the beautiful silk chiffon that I use for printing photographs to see, well, how do they take this color? How do they take the imprints of the plants that I'm using? And these are some of the swatches from the past 3 weeks. I haven't even been there that long, but I haven't been here that long, but the past 3 weeks, this is essentially all of the variations of colors and that I've been able to get. And these are all different kinds of studio views that you're getting. And these little things here are pigments. So throughout this whole process, I tried not to throw anything away. So my water bath, after I use it for dyeing, I save as much as I can to create pigments, and you reduce that down. It goes through this whole funneling process, and that's how you get paint. So I'm also making paints. They're drying right now. And hopefully they'll be dry in the next few days. Let's see all my beautiful colors. And the last thing that I've been doing is, okay, so I have this beautiful base of color. I'm also a printmaker. So how am I using this in all of the different kinds of processes that I work in? So I've been carving plates also while I'm here and creating these kind of designs that are all inspired by indigenous designs from the Caribbean, from Quisqueya, Haiti, and also Borinquen, and thinking about some of these beautiful linear patterns that we see in our culture that unfortunately, because of the world that we live in and capitalism and the colonial extraction, those of us that are from the Caribbean, there's a lot of gap in our history and a lot of knowledge that has been lost, especially with working in this manner, working with Indigenous practice, which all that I'm doing is Indigenous knowledge. This is knowledge that I've been able to piece together from family, whether they know it or not, consciously, whether they use certain language, friends that are also really thinking about reclaiming their history and their roots, that have been doing their own research around native plant, maybe not necessarily around art making or pigment making or image making, but maybe for healing or for just growth and land sovereignty work, so that we don't lose it. So this is the last thing that I did actually yesterday. So it's still drying, and thinking about overlaying some of my fabric with these larger designs. And this is actually using soil from here. This is soil from Horton, I think is the name of the beach, Horton Beach, which is over by South Old. So their soil, I realized, has a really high clay content for some reason, which need to do more research to figure out the history of this area to understand why that beach has such red soil, and is very high in clay. Be interesting to figure out what was happening in that area. And this is a view of my studio this morning. So this is where it is at the moment before I start cleaning up. And my hopes is to take all of this beautiful knowledge, take it back home to the Caribbean, and combine it with all of my processes that I do with photography, so that these images that are in platinum palladium are actually going to be printed solely using these organic pigments, and using some of these really beautiful fabrics that I see here, so that what I'm doing is creating a closed loop system with my work. And so thank you for being here, for listening. And I'm going to hold space for folks who might have any questions about what they're seeing, anything at all. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And you can please feel free to use the chat box, or even raise your hand, or unmute. We're an intimate group, so anyone can share.
Well, really wonderful to see all that work that you've been doing there. You've been very productive, and it's just so cool to see it so local, that you just go out there and gather your materials. It seems sort of weird that you're going to leave there now and not have that same connection. Is that weird for you?
No, because I am a nomadic person, and I split my time between the Northeast and the Caribbean. That to me, it's not, it's always part of the conversation. Like, this is not changing. The beautiful thing also about where I'm at, these plants are also in the Catskills, and which is where I live when I'm in the States. So that I already have plans for when I'm back in the Catskills for all of the things that I want to do using, like the white cedar, for example. They gave me this beautiful pink blush, and I'm like, I have plans for that. I don't have the time here to complete it, but I'm taking that knowledge with me, and it's going to inform things that I do in other places. So yeah, it's not sad, actually. It's just a comma, I guess. Oh, I'm honoring the chat box. Beautiful work. Would you say that this process was used before the heavy metals? Yes. So some of the materials that I'm using, like, for example, I keep saying this word mordant. which means to bite. And fabric needs something. It needs something to bite color down, essentially. It won't just take it. There are certain things that it will, that certain colors that it will take, but not the breadth of colors that you would want it to, or even the density of the color. And there are certain plants that are just naturally high in metals, naturally high in iron, in alum, in just because of the space that it's in, that you can harvest that, you can dry it. Again, it's like a process. Like you have to take it, you have to dry it. You then have to create a powder. That powder you have to weigh, mix it with boiling water, and then you have this bath, a mordant bath, and then you can start soaking your fabrics or paper, because this is the same process if you're doing it on paper, and soak your paper. So it has been used. The difficult part is that back home in the Caribbean, we don't have that knowledge recorded. So the plants that are high in tannin specifically for this kind of process, we don't have that, unfortunately, in a way that we can visit and then, stand upon that foundation. We have a lot of, like the New York Botanical Garden has collaborated with the Botanical Garden in Santo Domingo in the Caribbean, and they have an extensive collection online that you can browse, botany collection, that will speak to, from a colonial lens around these plants, what these plants were used from. But again, there's like a separation between like who gets to retell that history or to document that history, and there's still things that get lost. So we know that, for example, la jagua is used now primarily for paint, right? Painting the body, and we use it for drinks, but there's not a lot of information about using the jagua for fabric, for example. And I had to do a lot of trial and error to figure that out. And anyone else, more than welcome to ask any kind of question, anything that might come up.
Hi, Jeannette. Like I had the good fortune to visit her in the studio at the Potato Farm Project. I love your work, and I'm so impressed with the whole process that you have created for yourself. It's not more of a question, but like an observation. Is smell also an important part? Because when I was in the studio, like it smelled like you could smell everything that you were working with. So my question was like, is that also an important aspect that you try to incorporate in your work in some way?
Oh, thank you. It is very smelly. And I'm always concerned about that. If I'm in close proximity to other people and I'm working, I'm always like, this bath that I'm about to steam is going to smell hardcore. It is really important to me, the sensorial experience, right? When I'm working. Last year, I began playing around with a little bit of scent in the gallery space, specifically cacao, because of its significance in my culture and also with my family. But it's something that I want to think about more intentionally in installation work. One of the things that I'm thinking a lot about is creating installations that very similar to the one I did last year at EFA, where you're able to really walk around and you activated the piece because it moved with you, that when you are moving this piece, that you are also getting scents from the plants that I'm working with, which is not unlike, for example, the Brazilian artist Ernesto Neto, who is one of my favorite installation and textile artists who works a lot with the olfactory system and in gallery space or site specific work. But it's my next step. So I love that you're thinking about that. So
Yeah, it was all like eucalyptusy, and
Yeah.
I meant it in a very like good way. I thought it would be like nice to have that component. Yeah, very nice.
Yeah, it's the eucalyptus. It's just sticks to everything.
Yeah.
And it's also with the garments that I make, the regalia that I made for folks back on the island. I've been thinking a lot about the plants that are being used specifically for ceremony, for ceremonial regalia, because those things leach into our skins, right? So like the clothes that we wear, the color and the dye, the chemicals are leaching into our skin. I mean, just think about when you put something in a washing machine, right? You separate by color. Why do we separate by color? Because things leach out. That's when you're wearing it and you're sweating, that's also happening. So I was thinking, what would it be to wear something that's using plants that are significant to your healing journey and that's leaching onto your skin? What would that feel like to wear something that is made out of eucalyptus, that is made out of anamu, which is very specific to us in the Caribbean, or when we're thinking about certain herbs that might help us with infection, and we use that as a band-aid, right? Like these are not new ideas. They have been used in indigenous communities, but also thinking about how one of our elders, Irka, who I love, is always saying, "Somos Taino in 2022." Like we're indigenous folks in the modern time. So how are we taking this beautiful knowledge bank and bringing it into the space that we're in now? So how can my life practice be really about everything that I do, all of the breaths that I take, and not be separate from, so that all of the stuff that I'm doing with the fabric, with my family archive, with my photography, with the clothing, with me wearing it, it's that I'm literally breathing the creation process always, that it never ends, which is like essentially the goal for me.
Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you. Just want to leave space for anyone else if anyone has any questions.
Hi, Jeannette.
Hola, Elizabeth.
¿Cómo está, hermana?
De lo más bien. I'm home. I'm home.
Oh, I am here to acknowledge and to witness and to celebrate all of this amazing work. Your labor, your artistic brilliance. I'm just so blown away, hermana, and the way you bring in the indigenous knowledge into your work and your healing and who you are, every part of yourself. And just to hear you talking about the regalia that you want to make, that you've already made, but the intention of blending it with herbs that can help heal ourselves and our people, I'm just so blown away. And also that you're making your own paint. Good, like what don't you do? I'm just so blown away, and I'm again just here celebrating you and just so blown away by your work. Thank you for inviting me here. Yeah, just always so moved. And always also just, yes.
Gracias, Delanichi, tanto ternura. So grateful, honestly. Thank you for those words, and for being present, and being part of my journey.
Absolutely. You know, when I was seeing some of your process, Jeannette, especially with the fabric, it kind of reminded me almost of cooking cassava. You know, and it kind of
yeah.
As I'm seeing your process, having it under the sun, allowing it to dry, heating it. I mean, some of it I was like, wow, I mean, just really just blown away and overwhelmed, and just so inspired at how, again, bringing in the indigenous knowledge and the process into it. It's just really beautiful to witness, and very inspiring.
Thank you. I love that you brought in our beautiful Juca into the house. I think about that a lot, about how indigenous folks got to the point of working with, cultivating, and processing plants for the nourishment of themselves and their community. And like the Juca is one of those things, right? Like we think about Juca, poisonous, very toxic, but they knew how to process it. And it's the staple of our diet, and also of our dreams, right? Like the Juca has so much sweet significance to us, and that we have been able to work with it and eat it, consume it. And, we do so much stuff with that plant. And I think a lot about how do we acquire such knowledge? Like what had to happen in that time for us to get to the other side and be where we are now, right? So I think a lot about those things too. But thank you for sharing that and bringing it into the space.